say good afternoon, everybody. When you come in, if you wouldn't mind just muting your microphones, that would be brilliant. My name is Deirdre McGillicuddy, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to launch the UCD Rights Education Network. We're absolutely thrilled to have you all here today and to have our distinguished speaker here today as well, Emily. So thank you so much for joining us. The Rights Education Network is newly established here in UCD. And the idea is that it is an interdisciplinary initiative to explore rights education across all disciplines across the whole university. And what we want to do is create a space to reflect on how we can foreground the importance of rights education across the university. It has been led by myself and Dr. Gabriela Martinez-Sanz in the School of Education, alongside Associate Professor Suzanne Egan in the School of Law, and our colleague Dr. Muireann Ní Raghallaigh from the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice. And it has been funded by the College of Social and Science and Law Research Fund. However, we really want to emphasise that this network is open to colleagues, interested parties across all schools, all disciplines, all colleges in the university and outside of the university too. If you're interested in joining our network, please drop us an email at ren@ucd.ie. So that's ren@ucd.ie. We're actually having a brown bag lunch next week, next Friday, the 20th of November from 1 to 2 p.m. So if you're interested in coming along to that, we'll pop the link up for you later on during the conversation, and also feel free to drop us an email for that. In terms of this webinar, our hashtag is #UCD Rights Ed, if anyone's on Twitter. So feel free to tag that as we go through the conversation. I will shortly introduce Emily, who is going to speak about the importance of rights and rights education within Irish society and within the work that we hope to do across the Rights Education Network. Please feel free to write in any questions that you have for Emily in the chat box at the bottom of any screen. Just if you're coming in, if you wouldn't mind muting your mic, that would be fantastic. So please feel free to enter in any questions that you have, and we will have a question and answer session which will be hosted by Gabby and Muireann towards the end of the session. And Suzanne will come in then to close the session and reflect on some of the main themes. So without further ado, we are absolutely delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker today, Emily Logan. So Emily Logan is Adjunct Full Professor in the UCD School of Law and former Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, having been appointed by President Higgins in 2014. Prior to this, she served as Ireland's first Ombudsman for Children from 2003 to 2014, appointed by President McAleese. In 2008, she was nominated to the position of the President of the European Network of Ombudsmen for Children. And her contribution to the rights of children in Ireland, particularly children without parental guardianship, children in the care of the state, separated children or those deprived of their liberty, is widely acknowledged. So we are in really a distinguished company, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here today, Emily. So thank you so much for being with us. I suppose what we'd like to do is hand over to you for some comment around the importance of rights and rights education, Emily, within Irish society and within the work that we're doing within the university and across all of our disciplines. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks Deirdre, and thank you very much to Gabriela and Deirdre for inviting me, and Muireann and Suzanne. This is a great initiative. And I suppose I'm here because I absolutely believe everything I've ever done in my career is predicated on a deeply held belief in human rights and in human rights advocacy. I see a number of names here of friendly human rights advocates who know more, probably know more than I do about human rights advocacy. So what I was going to do was maybe just start with thinking about the articulation of human rights, the kind of more contemporary articulation of human rights, and reminding ourselves that where it began was after the Second World War in terms of our propensity as human beings to harm each other. And from that came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But in terms of the definition of, and this isn't a lecture on human rights education, I'm going to very quickly get to my experience, but in terms of the definition, so that I can frame just my comments, the definition of human rights education really is about training and information aimed at building a universal culture of human rights through the skills of sharing knowledge, But the two that I suppose I found most difficult, the second part of it is this definition, and if I'm going to share and impart my own information, is the second part of that definition, which I found most difficult in terms of practically applying human rights, was the imparting of skills. And then what's described by the UN World Programme on Human Rights Education as moulding of attitudes. So it's shifting the attitudes, shifting the culture to get people, in particular, in my experience, people who are making decisions and who are given authority to make decisions that can often very profoundly affect people's lives. And I suppose really that's really where I wanted to speak today to you, was about the skills needed to promote, defend, and then apply human rights in daily life. I mean, I don't think if you're here already in the room, in the right room, you're already a believer in human rights. So it's more how we apply and how we implement in ways that respect the people on whose behalf we're advocating. And then the second piece is the much more contemporary piece, and the piece that I'm personally very interested in is the much more emancipatory side of human rights, which recognizes people's own that people should be active participants in the exercise of their own rights. It's not up to those of us who are in positions of influence or in nominated positions as advocates, and to understand that our job is to be much more participatory in our work in supporting people who should be advocating for themselves. And if you look most recently, I mean, the most powerful movement going on in terms of human rights advocacy at the moment is the disability rights movement. And it's really coming into its own. And I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from disability advocates in terms of what we can do. I was going to mention two, I suppose, examples, practical examples that I had myself as Ombudsman for children, and thinking about some of the things that I learned along the way. Some of the key people that I engaged with to assist in advancing human rights, and how that was done through education. It was done through knowledge, it was done through information, and then it was about understanding when you need to speak to people who have that kind of knowledge to advance human rights. And the first one was an early, I suppose what I would describe as an early personal lesson for me back in 2006 as Ombudsman for Children. We undertook a very simple exercise in what we saw as democratizing human rights. And it was really about dissemination of information to all schools around Ireland in an effort to educate children about their rights. The project was called The Big Ballot. And what we did was we engaged, excuse me for looking down here now, but I have some notes here. But what we did was we engaged with people who had the kind of proximity to children and the understanding of their lives, who could support us and help us with the work. Obviously, the key educators there were teachers who were on the front line, who had proximate relationships to children, to families, to understand the kind of things that made a difference to them. And then we also engaged with civil society organisations and community organisations. And essentially what we did was, it was a three-phase project. The first was having your baseline piece of research, having your framework, your normative framework, your academic piece of work, or research to underpin what you're going to say, because it makes what you're going to say a more credible piece of work. So we did the research, then we engaged with the teachers to produce materials to make the information more accessible and to impart the skills beyond the realm of academics or lawyers or human rights advocates into the community of people who could support the development of human rights close to the lives. As Eleanor Roosevelt always talks about, or talked about, small places close to home, the people who can make a difference on a day-to-day basis, who in that case were children. And that project took place over a number of months. We ended up going on a bus, literally getting into a bus and going around by county to schools around the country to promote the project. And ultimately the project ended with a vote. So it mirrored the general election in 2007, where children set up polling stations. They voted by secret ballot, and they voted on the themes that we had brought to the fore in the research in terms of prioritising our work, but getting them to vote on what we should be prioritising. The project itself went very well. It completely overshot what we'd expected in terms of our expectation of engagement, with 75,000 children voting on what they thought were the most important rights. Now, I know the purists will kill me for saying that you would ask people to choose about what's more important. Ideologically, I understand the kind of indivisibility and interdependence, but when you're trying to transcend boundaries or borders to get people to understand what you're doing, you occasionally have to communicate in more mainstream ways that allows people to connect. And that was what we did. And the project went very successfully. It would be of no surprise to people that children, by a long shot, voted for families and children in care were the two things that they were most concerned about, that they wanted us to work on. But one of the things that I did learn, and I didn't plan for, and I was totally caught out about, was strategically I assumed that we would get a challenge or some kind of formal challenge from undertaking investigations or some of the harder hitting stuff. But this was the first attempted judicial review of our work in the Ombudsman for Children office. It was a lay litigant, Roger Eldridge, a gentleman who works for the National Men's Council, and their attempt to judicially review not just the project but also injunct the vote. So they wanted to stop 74,000 children having the vote on what they saw as our priorities. And it was a challenge we weren't expecting. It was a challenge that we did win, but the learning from that is understanding and anticipating people who don't agree with you, who don't see or feel threatened or undermined by your work, and understanding that's part and parcel of what you should be doing and what you should be anticipating if you are trying to educate others about human rights and if you are trying to advance human rights. The second piece of work just that I want to mention is back in 2007, we started a piece of work in St. Patrick's Prison. And ultimately that project was about getting the closure of St. Patrick's Prison, which was the last custodial place of detention for children in Ireland. It is now closed. But what was interesting about that project was it was about physically going into a medium secure prison to talk to the staff who were going to make a difference about children's lives, and to talk to the children and young people themselves. So these were young people between the ages of 16 and 21, with a primary focus on young people between the ages of 16 and 18. So what was interesting was we did have a framework. So there was a legal framework. There was independent monitoring and oversight mechanisms. At the time, you had two mechanisms. One was what's called a visiting committee, people who were charged with going into prisons and informally engaging with people in prisons to hear their concerns, although they don't have any power to resolve those complaints. And the second was the inspector of prison. And what was interesting to us was there was a completely different report when we spoke directly to the children and young people about their experience in St. Patrick's Prison. Now, for a long time, some of the visiting committees had been, I suppose there was a long time critique about visiting committees in Ireland as possibly not having the kind of level of independence that they should have. And this was reflected in some of their reports, where some of the content of the reports really didn't reflect or match the children and young people's experience in prison. And what was also very interesting talking to the young people themselves was the people who could make a difference and the people who were making a difference in their lives. And they were the teachers, the people that they trusted were the teachers in the school, in the prison. They were the chaplains who were visiting, who were coming into the prison and speaking to them on a one-to-one basis. There were social workers, drug counsellors. And the difficult piece I remember at the time was I remember going in as Ombudsman prior to the project starting and meeting with the young people. And of course, they had very little trust in state authorities very generally. And I understood that very quickly when they started asking me questions like, how big is your wallet? They were trying to suss out and trying to discern whether I was somebody that they could trust. So it was clear to me that, you know, it's not about being the nominated or the formal person with the privilege or the title or the power, that you must understand your own limitations and understand where the pathway of trust is for the people, for anybody that you're working with in terms of human rights. And for those young people, it was the chaplains, it was the drug counsellors, it was the social workers, it was the teachers. So what we did do is I met with a group of men who were, I met them through a homeless charity, and they were all young men who had been in PATS at some stage in their life. So they had been in prison and were able to guide me and advise me about how I might, or how we might as a team, build trust with the young people in St. Patrick's. So it's not enough. It's really, I suppose the learning for me from that was to understand that just being in a position does not automatically give you any sense of trust or respect from the people that you're working with. It also very quickly emphasized for me that interdisciplinary piece. It is the educators, it is the social workers, it is the people working in the health and education sectors. So it's that interdisciplinary piece and the value of that interdisciplinary piece. Now the prison has since closed, but I'm bang in the middle of writing a chapter. I'm co-authoring a book on children's rights with Ursula Kilkelly in UCC, and it's very interesting looking more deeply and trying to understand why certain things happened. And they were not happening, sadly, because of state authorities or designated departments that were in charge. They were happening within the prison from the people who believed and made very compelling cases about the young people and their situation. In terms of the things to consider, I just have a list of things to consider here. Looking back at the definition of human rights education, it is about knowledge, it's about information, it's about training. When I started as an ombudsman for children, even though I had long been an advocate and a person who had huge interest in social justice, I did not have the knowledge and I did not have the information. So it was really important to develop myself as an individual, to develop my own competence and develop my own confidence as somebody who was trying to advocate for others. The second is about that imparting skills, understanding that when you develop those skills, about being generous to others with those skills and sharing that learning with others. Don't keep the skills you develop to yourself. I have seen human rights education where people develop themselves but are slightly reluctant to develop others on the basis that they're benefiting hugely personally. They're gaining a huge amount from being the person with the expertise. The second one is in terms of molding attitudes, and this goes back to my point about yes, we have the framework for human rights, we have the international standards, we have the international law, we have the normative framework, if you like, but sometimes when you're talking to people and trying to convince them, it's to understand that they don't share that knowledge and they don't share that information. So if you are going to mold attitudes, it's try and communicate and to speak to people about the value of rights, but also to speak about the consequence of the denial of rights. And for me, that was much more powerful, was occasionally that secondary narrative of speaking to the consequences. So if this doesn't happen, or if this denial of rights continues, what the implications were in the case of St. Patrick's, what the implications were for young people who were in solitary confinement, on their own, feeling terrified, feeling anxious, what the implications were for those young people. I think I've spoken about accepting your own limitations, knowing when you're not the right person to do it, and knowing when you should bring on board other people who have trusted or close relationships and might be better placed to convince and persuade others of the change that needs to happen. You're launching the REN today, and I suppose I want to emphasize the significance of the collective effort and the interdisciplinary effort. And I've just, last year I finished as Chief Commissioner, finished my term as Chief Commissioner in the Commission. And what was really interesting, what I really learned there was the importance of a diversity of perspectives. And I'm not just talking about the normal list of definitions of diversity, but diversity of thinking, diversity of opinion, and how the rigor of having those conversations and debates before you go out into the big bad world to try and convince other people, how powerful they can be, because they push you and they challenge you. And it means you will be ready for that rebuttal. You'll be ready for that challenge if you've already gone through an internal process with colleagues in different disciplines or with diverse opinions who can assist you. Then, of course, allies, it goes without saying, you do need allies to keep you going when you're feeling really challenged and you can't see whether what you're working on is going to advance. And for me, that has been hugely important in terms of personal motivation, is to also have your allies, people who do believe and who will be the constant in your life to convince you to keep going, and how important that is. And on occasions, sadly, for the work that we did in St. Patrick's prison, our allies were international, they were regional. They were people like Thomas Hammarberg, who's the Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights at the time in the Council of Europe. They were the UN committees. When you're not being listened to in places that you should be listened to, it's to find allies somewhere else. I think I've mentioned persuasion. Powers and skills of persuasion are really important. And it's not only about, this was something that I learned from Nuala O'Lone, who was the police ombudsman in Northern Ireland when I began my role as Ombudsman for Children. And she said, you know, you're given a lot of responsibility, but you must treat that responsibility with respect. So in your engagement with other people, to be respectful, despite the fact that you may disagree with them. And ultimately, you may not share an aspiration of where you're going, but you still must engage respectfully with people. And to that, I think there's a lesson about what we need to think about, because I do think it's a bit of a challenge in Ireland at the moment, the kind of absolutist approach to human rights, and understanding that you don't hold a position, you know, you're not the purveyor, if you like, of human rights. There are people with different opinions, and that we shouldn't be striking people down because they don't share the same view as us. Because it hasn't developed into the kind of division in Ireland as it has in other countries, but it's important. While it is important that you have the knowledge and information, it's also important that when you come across other people who don't, and who share different opinions, is that you're not absolutist in your view and forcing, just talking to the standards, talking to the law and saying you're wrong. That is not going to achieve change, because it will divide our society, and it will mean we'll end up with groups of people who have two different opinions, who believe that the other side is wrong, and that's not the case. And finally, then, it's more just kind of the preparation for the secondary arguments, if you like, or secondary debates. So anticipating a little bit like my early lesson on the big ballot when there was an attempted judicial review, it's understanding that just because you're doing something that you think is right, it's not enough. You need to think and strategize beyond that. You need to think about the people who are not going to agree, the actions that they might take to undermine that work, what is open to them as much as what's open to you, what is open to them, so that you're ready for that challenge. But I think I've lost time because we started late now. I'm looking to Deirdre for guidance, but I think I'll stop there. But it was just to kind of share with you some of my many mistakes, but also a huge amount of learning and a huge amount of richness through collaborating with colleagues in other disciplines, and the richness that can bring.
That's fantastic, Emily. Thank you so much. I think that's one of the main aims of our Rights Education Network, is to work with colleagues across the university, you know, and really think a little bit about rights education and what we're doing, and are we doing enough of it, and how can we improve it. And I just think the themes that are coming up for me when I'm listening to you are the importance of trust, respect, and allies. You know, they're three of the themes that I'm pulling out as you're speaking. And I think they're really important values for us maybe to consider to bring into the Rights Education Network. I might hand over to my colleague Gabby, who may have some questions, more questions just to pick your brain, and then we'll open up to the floor. So please feel free to add your questions into the chat box, and Muireann is going to direct that now in a few minutes. So I'll hand over to Gabby.
Thank you very much, Dee. And Emily, I cannot thank you enough, not just to be here, but to kind of persevere with us through technology glitches and yes, and just give us your time and share with us your fantastic experiences, because I think all the things that we want to think about in this network and the things that we want to push with this network, which is collaborations, upskilling, sharing experiences, interdisciplinary dialogues, you are very much kind of an expert in living those things and living those values when it comes to rights education. So I really appreciate it. One of the things I want to ask, and you already started to talk about that, and for me, I think it's a very important issue, because when we talk about rights and we come together to form a network, we might run the risk of always preaching to the choir. As you were saying, like everyone here, we have a baseline. We agree on certain things about rights. We might disagree perhaps in the implementation, but it will be very difficult to disagree kind of in the starting points of the value of rights. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about these strategies from kind of the education part on how to deal with those who might not share the same baseline. You emphasize the idea of talking about the consequences of breaches of rights or denying those rights. But if you have any other kind of strategies, wild cards to use under circumstances.
I think it's more, the point is integrating it into your plan from the beginning. And the mistake that I made was I didn't do that. And when it came at us then, it was almost like we were blindsided. And we know enough now, if we look globally, if we look at what's happened recently in the US in terms of the undermining of democratic efforts to undermine democratic institutions, and limits placed on people's civil rights like freedom of association. We've seen it in places like Poland and Hungary. Is that there are people, it's understanding the reality that there are people who share different views, and to cocoon ourselves in a world, in a nice world of human rights where we all agree is occasionally very nice and very motivating. But in terms of really making a contribution, we have to engage with people, but not, I do think it's important, or how you engage is important. And in my experience, sometimes that was slow, long, hard discussions with people meeting people on one-to-one basis. It wasn't always in groups, finding key people, key leaders in those groups who are listened to and who are trusted. So in the same way that you're doing it in the human rights sphere, you can mirror those approaches with other groups. So if you're looking for trusted allies, so who are the allies? There will be allies. They may share a different view, but there are people in there that you can find who are trusted with the community, who have the proximity, who have the respect, who are leading, and to understand them and engage with them. And leaving them out of discussions, I think, actually exacerbates that division and can occasionally give people more power.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Emily. I won't take more questions because I can see that the chat is already filling it with some questions, and I would like the participants to have the chance to ask you questions. So I'm going to hand over to Maureen. I cannot see her in my...
I'm here, yes, don't worry, Gabby. Hi everyone, and thanks a million, Emily, for a great presentation. I was particularly interested in your insights about St. Pat's because I did a social work placement there many years ago, so it was great to hear about your experiences there. So just a few questions from the chat. I'm trying to keep up, but it's a little bit difficult, so apologies to anyone if I miss your question. So there's one there in relation to special education classes. How would you address the lack of special education classes within mainstream school settings for children in Ireland? So that's one, Emily, and I might give you another one. I think you're taking them down. What areas, somebody's asking, what areas do you think require the most imminent kind of reform or attention? So maybe if we start with those two. Sorry, Emily, we're putting you on the spot.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, I'm reminded of, I mean, special education really accelerated after the Synod judgment, after Jamie Sinnott's case. And that was really, I suppose, the beginnings. I think the Special Education Act 2004 was really where it began. And looking back at the disability movement, things changed quite considerably. Certainly politically, things moved on after 2004. But I do think there's an incongruity if you look at the legislation. So if you look at the Disability Act, so if you look at the framework for decision making, the Disability Act and the Special Education Act do not, there's an incongruity between them, certainly in terms of the definition of disability and how decisions are made. So I think there are jobs for lawyers in terms of tackling, the Disability Act is a very contentious act in terms of whether, I suppose it's questionable about whether it's a piece of rights legislation at all. But certainly in my experience as Ombudsman, there was huge disagreement between different departments. The Department of Education, who determine services for children with special education needs, and then the definition of disability in the 2005 Act. But for me, it's, I think there is some hope, and I see people like Vivian Rath there. I think there is a chink of hope in relation to disability rights at the moment. And the reason I say that is, unusually, the Disability Convention has been ratified by the European Commission. And it is the only international convention that has been ratified by the Commission. And that is new. So in my experience, a lot of the laws that have emerged, where a difference has been made in the last 10 or 20 years, if they're coming from the European Union, that can help politically. And if you look at what has happened, we now have the ratification, even though we were the last country in the European Commission to sign the Disability Convention in 2018. The European Commission now has a strategy on disability. We now have an Oireachtas committee on disability matters. So we have the beginning, it's kind of shaping up to be the beginning of a stronger disability rights provision in Ireland. But I think there's a long, hard journey that needs to be tackled. And I suppose the beginning of that was the special education through the Synod case. But we're nowhere near what needs to happen. There's a fight ahead there. But what I would say is, going back to my view on human rights as a more emancipatory approach to it, is supporting people with disabilities, because we've had a really terrible history in Ireland of having organisations that are run on behalf of people with disability instead of what are DPOs, disability people's organisations, where people with disabilities are running them and supported, whether by people with knowledge or skills who can inform and support their work. So I would, I suppose, make a plea for I need to be careful here what I say about advocacy, because I've spent all my life advocating, but proxy advocacy has its place. It's about direct advocacy by people who are affected, whether it's by legislation or by policy. In terms of areas, the second one, Warren, was about areas for reform.
Yeah, so areas where most imminent reform or attention you feel is needed. That's a tricky question, trying to decide what's...
It's a tricky question. I suppose there are two pieces. Well, the first is the legislative piece. So you have the law where you have the human rights articulated. And that is a struggle. And it's not only, it's not unique to Ireland. There's still, I think, one of the big criticisms that people like Philip Alston had for national human rights institutions is that they didn't spend enough time looking at economic and social rights, that we kind of spent a lot of time looking at civil and political rights. And really, if you look at what's happening in terms of whether it's geopolitics, in terms of divisions around the world, it's about economic inequalities, and to pay attention to that, because it's when people feel marginalized, excluded out of society, that some of the things that we have observed and witnessed in the last 4 or 5 years, that they're the kind of the root, the seeds of division or economic inequality, and we have to pay attention to, as much as we do to civil and political rights, we have to pay attention to economic rights. I think that is important. If you look at the programme for government, I would say it's important not to be or not to exclude the idea of engaging with politics either, because certainly everything I've done over the last 16 years, while every institution I've worked in has been apolitical, the issues you're working on are adjacent to politics. The people who make the decisions, whether it's the executive arm of government, whether it's the judicial arm, or whether it's the parliament, that it's really, really important to convince people. And one of the big advantages about Ireland is the size of it. It's small. People feel much closer to politics than they do in other countries. And it's to utilise that democratic process to engage with politics. If you can't do it nationally, to do it locally, to get people to agitate, to get people to champion the issues that need to be advanced. It's people sitting in the Shannon and the Dáil who will be asking those challenging questions. And it's to I suppose, to encourage you not to ignore that part of advancing human rights. It's a really important part of that. In terms of areas, gosh, I suppose I could list thematically. There are lots of people here who could list areas for reform, but kind of at a broader level is to talk about democratic processes and engaging with democratic institutions and how important that is. For me, I suppose one of the surprises for me for the last 16 years, or in the early days as Ombudsman, is to understand the power that's given to public and civil servants. I really did not appreciate how much decision making is delegated to, if you take something like the first question on special education and special education needs for children, I was astounded at the amount of decisions that were made at levels that weren't around a cabinet table, that weren't even at a senior level of a government department, that are made throughout civil and public administration. And it's understanding and finding out who are the decision makers, who are the people that we need to engage with. But I do think that's almost, it's not that it's invisible, I think it's largely because civil and public servants aren't allowed, or they're precluded from engaging in media or public arenas, is that there's this huge piece, really influential piece going on that people are unaware of and sometimes don't get access to. But it's to understand, if I'm just thinking of something like, if you take something like, say, access to assistive technology for children, those decisions are not made in primary legislation. Sometimes they're not even made in secondary legislation and statutory instruments. They'll be made in policy. Things like secondary or what do you call it, SI statutory instruments don't go through our House of Parliament or Oireachtas, so they're not debated by politicians. So it's understanding and finding out, so it's researching, it's finding out where those decisions are made in an effort to try to influence them.
Thanks, Emily.
I feel like I'm being re-traumatized here for all the mistakes I've made.
No, it's all really helpful. I might just pose one other question, if that's okay. I'm afraid we're kind of running out of time. So this question, in terms of human rights education, would you recommend campaigning and advocating on a specific issue or right? So, for example, the right to housing, or through a more community or group needs-based approach? So, for example, youth, women, a given minority group. So whether you'd recommend advocating on a specific issue or right, or more in relation to a group or needs-based approach, like youth or women, for example?
Oh, I'm always just a little bit reluctant to immediately limit yourselves by deciding that you're going to take a single thematic area. I mean, the value of human rights education is the general good for society. So whether it's teaching children in primary schools and secondary schools, it's a broad education for society, for people to understand what rights means in the first place. But if you want to do it by group, I do think I do think if you listen to people like Brian Stevenson, who's worked on death row in the US as a human rights lawyer, he talks about proximity as a really powerful means of creating change, and communities, that's where, you know, that's the closest you can get to people. So I do think listening to communities and understanding what's happening at community level should assist. But if it's possible to run the broader piece of the importance of human rights education and with your thematic.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Emily. And thanks everyone for the questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. I'm going to hand over now to Suzanne, who's going to make a few closing remarks. And Dee has also put some information into the chat there about our brown bag lunch next week and our email address. Thanks everyone.
Okay, just remains for me, I suppose, to close proceedings and to join. Oh, I think I might mute it. Can you hear me? You can.
You're on two different devices, Suzanne, so I think there's a bit of feedback.
Oh, yes, I'm echoing like crazy here, so I can hardly hear myself speak, but I'll proceed anyway. Emily, I want to thank you with Dee. Is that driving everyone crazy?
No, it's okay.
I think it's okay.
Is there an echo going on for everyone?
I think so, but I think it's okay. I think
go ahead, Suzanne.
Do I just mute myself?
No, just continue. You're okay.
Okay, I'll continue. I'll just keep it short. Emily, thank you so much. I really want to just join with Dee and Gabby and Murren. We really couldn't have asked for a better start, a better kickoff to our network. You've given us some incredibly important and valuable insights into your experience of human rights education and in the Children's Ombudsman, and of course as well through your work with the Human Rights Commission. And I think the experience that you shared with us is experience that is valuable no matter what context one is trying to roll out a program of human rights education, whether it's with children in schools, whether it's at university level, or whether you're working with an organization, an NGO, for example, and going into a human rights education program. You've spoken to us about the importance of developing competence and confidence in our skills as human rights educators and the importance of sharing those skills. You've talked about the importance of connecting with people in mainstream ways, which is ever more important in the contemporary world that we live in. I thought the reflection that you gave us about anticipating and tapping into pathways of trust for the group that you're engaging with is just so important. And I thought, as well as pointing out the importance of having allies, the responsibility that we all have as educators in having respect for those who don't agree with us whenever we are in the process of human rights education is incredibly important. And then lastly, and most importantly, the importance of interdisciplinarity and the diversity of opinion in planning and engaging in human rights education. So each of these insights is important on its own, but collectively they really give us such a great overview of so many of the important things that you have gained from your insights and that we can bring to the table as educators ourselves. So I'd like to thank everyone also for joining the webinar. We're absolutely delighted with the incredibly positive response. It's fantastic to see so many people engaging with us. And we'd really, really like to continue that engagement. We plan to have a number of events over the course of the academic year, but starting again next week then with a brown bag lunch, which has been mentioned already. We hope that everyone will bring their own bags, their virtual lunches.
Is that online, a brown bag lunch online?
A brown bag lunch. So we hope to see many faces scoffing a few sandwiches next Friday, November the 20th at 1 o'clock. With your permission, we're going to send the link out to those of you who have responded to our invitation to the event today. If you'd rather not be emailed by us, please feel free to opt out by using our ren@ucd.ie email address. Otherwise, we will send the link, and we hope very much that you'll be able to join us next week, where we can hear about and discuss together what programs of human rights education or what involvement you have in rights education, and what you'd like to see coming out of our network going forward. So thank you all very much, and thank you again in particular, Emily.
Yes,
very grateful for you for your talk today.